Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining Emmett's weekly webinar. We always appreciate your continued support. And in that regard, I just wanted to remind everyone about our annual Rays of Light in the Darkness dinner and award ceremony, which is going to be on December 5th in Washington, D.C. It's going to be a really special evening with important and influential honorees. And I just think that meeting in person these days in particular, where, we're living through historic times for the Jewish people, we would love to share the evening with you. And I hope to see you all then. While Israelis are rightfully angry and disappointed with their government and its intelligence failures in the lead up to the October 7th massacre of Israeli Jews, and I'll add that the same intelligence failures existed in the Biden administration as literally just days before the Hamas attack, U.S. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan embarrassingly stated, quote, "The Middle East region is quieter today than it has been in 2 decades." I believe that U.S. policy under both the Obama and Biden administrations played a significant role in the Hamas attacks. This afternoon, we are honored to have the always brilliant and insightful Caroline Glick to discuss the failed U.S. policies that helped lead to Hamas's brazen invasion of Israel and Biden administration policies in the aftermath of those events that may ultimately hinder Israel's ability to achieve its existential goal of destroying Hamas. In the interest of time, because we have a lot to talk about, I'm going to forego reading Caroline's impressive bio, as I'm sure that you all are familiar with her important work. Her reputation precedes her, and I urge you all to follow her regular columns and her podcast, The Caroline Glick Show, at JNS. Welcome, Caroline, and thank you for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me back.
It's always great, Caroline. Thank you. While the Biden administration has spent the first 3 weeks of this war bending over backwards to claim that Iran did not play a role in the Hamas attack and that there's no direct evidence that the supreme leader gave the order for Hamas to attack Israel, anyone who follows foreign affairs understands that Hamas is an Iranian terrorist proxy organization that's funded, trained, and weaponized by the Islamic Republic. It's therefore impossible to discuss the atrocities committed by Hamas on October 7th without looking at the policies of the Obama and Biden administrations that helped to fund, arm, and empower Iran and its terrorist proxies in the first place. In fact, immediately after news of the attack broke, Leo Leibovitz wrote an article he entitled "America's Betrayal of Israel," in which he stated, "The stage for this attack was not set in or by Israel, it was set by the United States." I know you could spend the entire hour discussing this, but can you spend a few minutes talking about what we know about Iran's role in this and how the U.S.'s feckless and ideologically driven policy of empowering Iran and thus Hamas, helped to lead to these events? And if you can share your thoughts on on the Obama-Biden policies, including, the nuclear deals, the ransom payments, the maritime deal, maybe anything that you think that contributed. And I urge everyone to actually read your recent column, Biden's Hamas Conundrum, that can be found at JNS as well.
And everything can also be found on my own website, carolineglick.com, where I have an archive of my work going back to 2002. And so just, in terms of this, I think that there's a lot of blame to go around. Israel has been led, particularly on the military level and the general staff, by people who are really politicians in uniforms. And so they have used their office in order to advance a political agenda, which involves appeasing the Palestinians, which fits in very well with dependence on the United States and on not carrying out a preemptive attack against either Hezbollah or Iran. So there's a lot of blame to go around. But insofar as the Biden administration is concerned, you're absolutely right. Look, I mean, yesterday, Yemen declared war on Israel. Yemen is led by the Houthi regime, which is an Iranian proxy, as everybody full well knows. And one of the first orders of business that the Biden administration took care of as soon as they came into office in January 2021 was that they removed the Houthis from the list of foreign terrorist organizations. So the United States, since Biden has come into office, has taken concerted steps to empower Iran and its proxies. The same is true in Lebanon. The United States, unfortunately, the Trump administration did not stop this insane policy that was enacted under the Obama and Bush administrations previous to that, which is, this is a bipartisan insanity, which is that there's some distinction between Hezbollah and the government of Lebanon, the Lebanese armed forces, the Lebanese intelligence forces. When there is not, there was an interview that Memory posted, I think by the foreign minister of Lebanon, but I'm not sure, by one of the senior officials in Lebanon. And he was explaining that the Lebanese prefer to have a regional war than to confront Hezbollah. And that makes sense because, and he explained why. He said, because a regional war means that the UN will be with us. And by the way, so will the rest of the international community against Israel. And we'll be part of a big group of Arab Islamic countries that are opposed to Arabs, to Israel, and will be supported by the entire world. But, if we go against Hezbollah, that's very dangerous for us. So that the prospect of actually ousting Hezbollah from its dominant position in Lebanon is too frightful to contemplate. And the Lebanese, from their perspective, the government, the people, prefer to go to war against Israel, where Israel will level much of the country in its effort to cut down, to defeat Hezbollah's massive missile capability that is poised against Israel. So Israel will come in and bomb Lebanon and take out a lot of its infrastructure, a lot of buildings, etc. We have 150,000 at least missiles that Hezbollah has deployed against us, pointing in our direction. So we'd want to do that probably preemptively to at least minimize somewhat their ability to shoot thousands of missiles at us on a daily basis for months. So what he said was they'd rather, the implications of what he said is that from Lebanon's perspective, they know that if they go to war against Israel, the UN will just pay for them to rebuild. And of course, the United States as well. And that brings us to the Biden administration. So as Tony Badran has copiously documented in a series of articles at Tablet Online Magazine, not only is the United States paying the salaries of Lebanese soldiers in cash, which is insane, and it's also illegal under U.S. Tariff financing laws. They're also paying in cash the salaries of the Lebanese intelligence service. And the Lebanese intelligence service itself played a key role, arguably played a key role in blinding Israel to the preparations for war that Iran was directing in the months leading up to the October 7th invasion and slaughter, because the U.S. funded Lebanese intelligence services have published over the past 2 years that they have exposed, revealed, and broken up, I think, 17 different Israeli spy networks, so that assuming that their claims are accurate or even partially accurate, it means that U.S. taxpayers are directly funding an organization that is an espionage organization that works on behalf of Hezbollah, which is Iran's foreign legion in Lebanon. So the contention of the U.S. funded both in terms of their regular budget and in terms of paying the actual salaries in cash to Lebanon's intelligence officers, that money goes directly to spying against Israel on behalf of Hezbollah and Iran. All right, and that's an extraordinary state of affairs, and that is the Biden administration's policy on Lebanon. So that's one aspect of it. In relation, and this is, and of course we saw with the Biden administration as well, that last year, just a year ago, they literally coerced Israel, which was an interim government going into elections on November 1st, 2022. They forced Yair Lapid and his government to accept a maritime border agreement with Lebanon that everybody in Israel opposed, because not only did it surrender a natural gas deposit in the Eastern Mediterranean to Iran through Hezbollah, it also surrendered Israel's territorial waters and our economic waters to Lebanon, even though it was very clear that they had no claim to them, okay? And so what that deal that was signed by an interim prime minister, Yair Lapid, on the eve of the elections did was it transformed Iran Hezbollah into an actor in the East Mediterranean gas industry, which is just stunning. It lowered Israel's importance from a strategic perspective in the eyes of countries like France, because they can just get natural gas from Hezbollah, Lebanon, Total Energy. The French energy concern was responsible for doing the development of the field. And luckily, miraculously, really, a week before the October 7th invasion, these French geologists who conducted the survey said that they found no gas in the platform. So that was a bit of good news amidst a lot of terrible news and much worse news that we received on October 7th. So that's good. But the American intent and understanding was that there was natural gas in that platform. And hopefully the geologist assessments is correct and there'll be no gas in Lebanon. But the American intent was to do that. Excuse me a second. Then the other thing is that ahead of this war, the United States the Biden administration began trying to coerce Israel into accepting the demarcation of the land border between Israel and Hezbollah along the lines that Hezbollah demands, including Israeli territorial concessions around Nahariya and going through and extending into the Golan Heights. To this end, the United States agreed to a draft of a resolution in the UN Security Council that reinstated the operational mandate of UNIFIL, the UN force that's supposed to prevent Hezbollah from militarizing the border with Israel, but of course has failed from the outset and will never succeed. But it was to reinstate their mandate. And in the resolution that was passed in the Security Council, I think in September or in late August, the wording of it is Israeli occupied Sheba Farms. Now, Sheba Farms is a Lebanese name for Mount Dov, which is a vast area in the Golan Heights. Okay, and it's obviously strategically important. It stands and really controls the tri-border area between Israel, Syria, and Lebanon. And all along, the claim was that Sheba Farms were initially, the Americans said Hezbollah doesn't have a right to these areas because after Israel withdrew, they claimed that they had sovereignty over Mount Dov. And the United States responded no, because it's part of the Golan Heights, which is part of Syria. So you can't make territorial claims against Syria. So America was able to sort of fend them off that way. And then, of course, in 2019, the United States recognized Israeli sovereignty over the Golan Heights. And so when the Biden administration agreed to the wording of the resolution that on the extension of the UNIFIL mandate, it said the occupied Sheba Farms, which it means that the United States effectively renounced its recognition of Israeli sovereignty over the Golan Heights without doing it formally. They did it in effect by agreeing to a Security Council resolution that referred to this area of the Golan Heights as occupied. And they also are pushing Israel. Amos Hochstein was starting shuttle diplomacy before the invasion that was trying to coerce the Netanyahu government this time to accept Hezbollah's territorial demands over the Golan Heights, as well as and extending to the water line in Nahariya. So this is, again, this is simply a hostile pro-Iran policy, pro-Hezbollah policy. And insofar as the Palestinians are concerned, so it's Mr. Hadi Amar is the U.S. Special Representative to the Palestinians. And as I've written in recent weeks, and I wrote it in 2021 when he was appointed to be, in charge of the Assistant Secretary of State for Israel and the Palestinian Authorities, which they changed the name, by the way, to Israeli and Palestinian Affairs, because because if they couldn't use the term Palestine, then they weren't going to use the word Israel either. So if they want a two-state solution, first they have to cast in doubt the existence of Israel. But that's just a little aside. At any rate, Hadi Amar is a Hamas supporter, an open Hamas supporter. In 2018, he was a fellow in Doha, in Qatar, which of course is Hamas's state sponsor along with Iran. And at the Brookings Institute, and the Brookings Institute, of course, even in Washington, it's financed by Qatar to the tune of millions of dollars. And so in this report, he was a lead author of, that was published in 2018 when he was in Qatar, he called for the United States to adopt a new policy regarding the Hamas-controlled Gaza Strip that involved setting up a unity government that would be dominated by Hezbollah, that would control both the Palestinian Authority controlled by Fatah, controlled by the PLO in Judea and Samaria, and Hamas's control over Gaza. And since Hamas has the support of the majority of Palestinians, so Hamas would join the PLO and become the most powerful faction inside of the PLO, and then they would form a coalition with Fatah that would run these areas together with Hamas essentially carrying the day. So that was Hadi Amar's thing. He also called for changing American terror financing law in a manner that would allow the United States to directly fund through USAID NGOs that were operating directly with Hamas in Gaza. So he was for funding Hamas essentially through USAID contractors. And that was what he wrote from outside government in 2018. He also wanted the United States to coerce Israel into ending its maritime blockade over Gaza, and he wanted to use European sanctions law against Israel as a means to coerce Israel into making further concessions to Hamas and Hamas-controlled Gaza that he laid out in his policy paper. So this was a pro-Hamas policy paper that wasn't surprising because already going back to 2002, Hadi Amar had a track record of supporting suicide bombings, or supporting Hamas as a legitimate force in Palestinian affairs. So he is a Hamas supporter. In office, both as the Assistant Secretary of State for Israel and the Palestinians, and now he was upgraded to Special Representative to the Palestinians. He is in charge of all U.S.-Palestinian relations. He was supposed to be here as the Consul General in Jerusalem, but both the Bennett-Lapid government and the Netanyahu government have vetoed and blocked American and refused to agree to the U.S. request to open a Consul General to the Palestinians in our capital. But that remains a steady and strong, even hysterical at times, U.S. demand from Israel that we allow them to open a consulate to the Palestinians in our capital city. So he as the special representative and in his previous position was able to get the administration to reinstate U.S. funding to the Palestinian Authority, even though an internal report of the State Department warned that money to the Palestinian Authority was in contravention of the Taylor Force Act, of course, because the Palestinian Authority spends upwards of 100 million shekels a year paying salaries to terrorists jailed in Israeli prisons, so they incentivize terrorism in that regard, and also because the comptroller said that money could indirectly fund Hamas, and there was no way of preventing that from happening. In other words, the State Department's in-house counsel was saying this is reinstating U.S. funding to the Palestinian Authority is illegal. They disregarded his report and they continued and they reinstated, and the United States has been giving about $500 million to the Palestinian Authority. It's been pressuring Israel. Just a month and a half ago, we had this huge story that the United States was trying to force, again, through their coercive measures and blackmail of the Netanyahu government. And remember, we were still in the middle of a domestic insurrection by the left that was supported by the Biden administration at this time. So they were trying to coerce the government into allowing heavy weapons to be brought into the Palestinian Authority, U.S. heavy weapons. And the only reason it was blocked is because I think Itamar Ben-Gvir, the national security minister, and Bezalel Smotrich leaked this to the media. And once it got out, there was a public outcry against it, and the government had to say no to the Americans. But it was only because it was leaked before it could be done that it was blocked. So that's the Palestinians. So it's the U.S. Palestinian effort is led by a Hamas supporter. And of course, U.S.-Iran policy is led, or was led until he was ousted from government under suspicion of security and security crimes, national security crimes, Robert Malley. Robert Malley since he was in the Clinton administration as a junior staffer at the National Security Council at Camp David. He has pursued an adamantly, vituperatively anti-Israel line. He also supports Hamas. He has met with Hezbollah and Hamas terrorists, which is the reason that he was unable to join the Obama administration during Obama's first term in office. But then he was brought in as a senior negotiator with the Iranians in his second term of office from the National Security Council. So Robert Malley, I'm sure you all saw the reports, the exposés that were simultaneously published in Semaphore and in Iran International that exposed that three of Malley's closest advisors, assistants, Ali Fayad at the International Crisis Group, which he led after he left the Obama administration, and also worked with before he entered the Obama administration when he was the head of Middle East and North Africa for the International Crisis Group. Ali Fayez, Ariane Tabatabai,
we
and
actually
another
held a webinar on the topic with Tony.
right.
Yeah.
So they're not I think that my suspicion about those exposés was that somebody in the FBI who is concerned about Robert Malley, or somebody within the government was the source of the information, and they were trying to get it out because it was a signal that Robert Malley himself is also an Iranian regime agent. But whether he's an Iranian regime agent or simply a hardened pro-Iran ideologue, it almost doesn't matter at this point when we look at the extremism of the radical left. I don't think that AOC works for Iran, and yet she works for Iran because her brain has been programmed to support everything that Iran wants. So it almost doesn't matter. But the point is that you have this administration that's staffed with people who are hostile to Israel and are sympathetically inclined towards Hamas, towards Hezbollah, and towards Iran. And the thing that's most disturbing about the entire situation is that since October 7th, nobody has been removed from office. To the contrary, they're all still there. So you have Biden on the one hand talking about how much he supports Israel and Golda Meir, and he keeps telling the same story about Golda over and over and over again, and hugging the families of the desperate families of the hostages. But his policies on the ground have been absolutely hostile towards Israel in almost every regard. So, I mean, just the so-called humanitarian aid is self-evident.
I want to just stop for 1 second because we're going to get to humanitarian aid and all of the Biden policies post October 7th. Okay. And I'm going to turn to those. I also, the one thing that I would say that you did not get to, because I'd probably just cut you off, is the 20,000 work permits that Biden forced Israel to give to Gazans who were crossing back and forth from Gaza into Israel and collecting intelligence also. And I think that was a huge failure that also contributed that I blame this administration. But let's turn to post the Hamas, the attack of October 7th. I mean, I watched your last show with Victor Davis Hanson, and I was struck at his simple honesty when he stated that, quote, Biden is woefully unsupportive of Israel. He added, we have the least effective government for what is going on now in our lifetimes. I couldn't agree more. And despite many people, including Israelis, praising the administration's stance on the war, Biden and his team have actually been constraining Israel rather than supporting her. I want to start with the delay on the ground invasion. There were numerous reasons given for the delay. Biden was flying into Israel. Then Biden said, the administration said Israel wasn't ready militarily and strategically. And then it was the U.S. wasn't ready. The U.S. had to move its own defensive assets in to protect American soldiers, which I think is horrible to state that as a reason, to say that American lives are being put at risk due to Israel. And then there were other various reasons. And John Bolton even went so far as to say that Biden has his hand around Bibi's belt. So can you talk about your thoughts on American interference in the timing of the ground assault? And does it portray weakness and timidity as John Bolton had actually said in an article that he wrote?
Whose timidity? Israel's or the Americans?
He said, yes, his exact quote was, in the face of this barbarity, Iran is seeing weakness and timidity. And I believe he was referring to both Israel and the United States.
So I think that it's true of the United States. I'm not convinced that it's true of Israel because it is true that all of the reasons given for the delay of the ground invasion had to do with American interference in Israel's operational decision making. And at the same time, there were very good operational reasons to delay the ground invasion. First and foremost, that Gaza is, it's a fortified camp. It's booby trapped. They've been preparing for this for years. Most of their terrorists are burrowed in tunnels that are, a kilometer or so, or not a kilometer underground, but hundreds of meters underground. And we needed ordnance, including bunker buster bombs, in order to reach the tunnels to degrade their capacities and force as many of the Hamas fighters above ground as possible before we committed our forces. I don't know what happened with Givati yesterday, but I do know that these terrorists, like the Viet Cong, they're popping out from tunnels, and it's a very, very, very chaotic combat environment in Gaza. Not only is it populated and urban, you have the terrorists who are hiding, and they know where they are and they know where you are. So their operational awareness is much higher. So we had very good reasons to want to prolong the aerial operations before we began committing ground troops. So I think that it's true on the part of the United States. I'm not convinced that it's true on Israel's part. Having said that, the United States has been interfering from the very outset in our operational calculations and in a way that degrades, I think, the readiness and the tempo of our operations, as well as our path to victory.
So here's another way that America has intervened. We're going to turn to Hezbollah, which you brought up a little earlier. And I know that there were Israeli officials who wanted to preemptively strike Hezbollah in order to knock out as much of its weapons depots as possible and to ameliorate some of the damage if a second front were to activate in the north. Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin was in Israel, and he told Israel not to attack Hezbollah. He promised the U.S. would have Israel's back if a second front broke out. While Israel for years has sought to avoid escalation on the north, the U.S. has been doing everything it can to not provoke Iran for fear of a greater war. But do you really believe that the U.S. will protect Israel when and if a northern front opens up? I mean, I've read that on his flight home, Biden denied that he ever said that he would have Israel's back in that capacity. So, again, the U.S. response to Iranian attacks, we're going to talk about that maybe in a couple minutes, but it's U.S. assets are being attacked in Syria and Iraq, and the U.S. response has been unbelievably weak. So what are the chances that the U.S. will actually have Israel's back if Hezbollah opens up a second front, given that Biden prevented you guys from preemptively striking?
My assessment is that it is based on what Biden said on Air Force One, and also on his overall behavior, and the fact that he's been working more steadily and taking more concerted action to deter Israel from striking than he has to deter Iran from striking. For instance, he didn't cancel the transfer of $6 billion to Iran. He's been hiding and covering for Iran, as you mentioned, its very clear role in planning and training Hamas forces for the October 7th invasion. And of course, they fund 93% of Hamas's budget. So, I mean, he has been acting as Iran's first, number one apologist. He and his advisors have since October 7th, and refusing in the face of mountains of evidence to acknowledge that Iran was behind this attack. It's startling. So, these are actions that are not taken by a superpower interested in deterring Iran. But what he has also done is linked American military aid to Israel, meaning the provisions of weapons that Israel requires in order to prosecute this war successfully, to Israel making concessions to Hamas and to not fighting Hezbollah, so that the bunker buster bombs that we need in order to break up the tunnels from above ground from aerial bombing that was conditioned on allowing humanitarian aid, so-called resupply to Hamas through Rafah, and also to not attacking Hezbollah in Lebanon. So that, this is an extraordinary thing. So the side that he deterred was Israel, not Iran. They keep saying, if Iran or any of you proxies, which of course they don't name Iran, right? There's any country or non-state actor is thinking about taking action, I have one word for you: don't. Right? That's what he says. That's what Blinken is saying. That's what Lloyd Austin is saying, etc. But they never say what the or else is, because as you said, Lori, right? They don't have an or else. The United States last count that I saw had been attacked 23 times, and since I saw that count, they've been attacked multiple additional times. And as you said, they've had almost no response. So there's no, and on the other hand, the response has been to coerce Israel into limiting its offensive operations against Hamas and doing only tit for tat with Hezbollah. I mean, we're losing soldiers. We've been losing soldiers in the north. My neighbor, my friend's son was killed in the north in a tank accident on Sunday night, and he was in. So you could say, well, he was an accident, but we have had like 4 or 5 soldiers killed from Hezbollah fires since October 7th, and here he is. We're the ones who are being deterred by the Americans. So I mean, this is just ridiculous. He's not deterring Iran. I mean, the Houthis, Yemen just declared war on Israel. There's no deterrence here. It's a joke.
Yeah, yeah. And there was actually a young man from Maryland who was also killed up north.
That's right. I went Balva. I went to his shiva as well. A great family.
Horrible.
Great family.
Horrible. So let me ask you something. Jonathan Shanzer and some of the folks at FDD have made the suggestion that Iran may very well decide not to greenlight Hezbollah, since it serves as a vital deterrent to a possible Israeli attack on Iran's nuclear facilities. What are your thoughts on that? Do you think that? I mean, I'd like to believe that that's true.
Well, we'd all like to believe that that's true. We also wanted to believe that Hamas was deterred on October 7th, right. But that wasn't true. We'd also like to believe that Biden has Israel's back, but that doesn't seem to be true. So the fact that from our perspective and our thinking, this is what makes sense for Iran to do, doesn't mean that that's how Iran sees anything. Certainly we can't bet on it. Right. You can't build a strategy for fighting a war based on an assessment by some guy in Washington who may or may not be right. I don't know if he's right. Maybe he's right. It makes sense to me, but I'm not Ali Khamenei.
Yeah, yeah. So my next concern is this push for a ceasefire. And look, we know that the goal was to undermine normalization between Israel and Saudi Arabia. At least that was one of them. But it was also to set the international.
It's also to kill Jews. I mean, it's also to destroy Israel. Their strike plan, that we saw in documents and from statements by captured terrorists from October 7th, captured terrorists and documents, is, first, I mean, you have to understand that Hamas screwed up. Now, this is it's a theory that seems substantiated by events that Moti Kedar and others have put forward, which is that, Hamas wasn't supposed to attack on October 7th. Because all of the meetings that Kayani, the head of the Al-Quds force of the Revolutionary Guard Corps, Soleimani's replacement, held in Beirut with Hamas leaders and with Hezbollah leaders in the months preceding the events, the goal was to have a coordinated assault on Israel between the Hamas terrorists and the Radwan terrorists of Hezbollah. And they were both supposed to operate in the same way of invading, slaughtering Israelis, and then moving on. And they were supposed to seize territory, and they were supposed to effectively cut off central Israel from the rest of the country, with thousands of terrorists marauding through southern Israel and northern Israel, blocking access to Air Force bases, right? Essentially, and mobilization points to crash Israel. So we have thousands of hostages in Lebanon and in Gaza, and we have thousands of terrorists from Hezbollah and from Hamas in northern and southern Israel. We can't get to our air bases. We can't mobilize our forces that are cut off from one another because of the way that they're swarming around our territory inside of Israel in the Galilee and in the Negev and up to Beersheba, and Israel collapses. That was the plan. That was the master plan. But what happened was the Nova Music Festival. So you have these slobbering, bloodlust plagued monsters in Gaza, and the workers who work in Gaza bring back the advertisements for the Nova Music Festival, and they know that right across the border from them, you're going to have thousands of sexy, drunk, drugged out, young Israeli women and men dancing in plain sight, and it's just raw meat to a lion. And so they jumped the gun and they assumed that Hezbollah would join them early, and they invaded Israel. And then they got so excited by the murder that they forgot that the rest of the program. So they got stuck slaughtering Jews and raping women for hours in Reim, in the music festival, and in the kibbutzim, and they didn't advance. And in those 3 hours that all they were doing was slaughtering, you had first responders in the local guards that were killing them on their front lawns. You had people like Elchanan Kalmanzon from Otniel and his brother and brother-in-law coming down to the south on their own, these reservists from counterterror units. And you had counterterror units that were coming together, and they were operating without instruction from higher up in the IDF, and just putting themselves in the line of fire and killing terrorists and saving people. They said that the Kalmanson brothers saved, I think, upwards of 40% of the survivors of the massacre at Be'eri. These 3 men who came in from their house, okay, on Simchat Torah, because they heard what was happening. And they just came and they did it. And you had and fathers of girls who were stuck at the music festival coming down to save their daughters, and at the same time they saved dozens and dozens more young people from the slaughter. And so you had these acts of incredible courage by just Israeli civilians, reservists, counter-terror commandos, who were doing it all on their own. But they stopped the invasion. They killed over 1,000 terrorists. And it gave the IDF the opportunity, because they were there, to come to its senses. I mean, the Air Force, the helicopters that were up in the air first, they were doing it in unauthorized flights, because the headquarters of the Air Force wasn't giving them permission to take off. They took off on their own against the orders that they received from Air Force headquarters, because the Air Force was in a state of shock. So you have, like, it was because of the courage of these people that Israel survived this, that they blocked the invasion, and then the army was able to get together and start bringing in the forces. But it was already afternoon. So if they had extended forward, to base in central Israel, or the Southern Command, or whatever it was, in Kiryat Malachi, and managed to take it, we would have been in a completely different situation, because then Hezbollah probably would have come in. But Hezbollah in the north is looking and seeing that they're not advancing, right? And they see that the IDF is coming to its senses, and probably that was what informed the decision by Hassan Nasrallah not to join the invasion on October 7th. And so we, had a miracle here happen, because they saw the raw meat at the Nova Festival. And it's a crazy thing, but that appears to be the most articulate and the most reasonable theory of why it went wrong, why we were able to, take a couple of weeks, albeit it's true, but actually be on the offensive now instead of being in a state of national collapse.
Yeah, so I was not aware of that, and that's really interesting. But now we are on the offensive, and we know what that means from an international, from the cognitive word standpoint and international opinion standpoint. And we're already hearing condemnations and screams and yells. And I'm not talking about the idiots on the street, the students and the pro Hamas people on the streets. I'm talking about the UN. I'm talking about some Western nations, and I'm even talking about the Biden administration that yesterday called for a pause, which is a euphemism for, a form of a ceasefire. So, back in 2014, during Operation Protective Edge, Obama and Kerry did the same thing. And the brilliant Thomas Sowell at the time wrote, if this was the first outbreak of violence between the Palestinians and the Israelis, such hopes might make sense. But where have the US, Kerry, and Obama been during all these decades of endlessly repeated Middle East carnage? And I mean, he also noted that when Hamas and other terrorist groups launch an attack on Israel, they know in advance that whatever Israel does in response will be limited by calls for a ceasefire. So, what do you say to people who call for Israel's response to be proportional, for Israel to follow international law? I don't even know what that means, in the face of these animals who certainly committed war crimes. Can you address this? How does Israel, finish the job with this pressure on?
Look, I mean, we're it really depends on how the Republicans behave right now, okay? Because, Republicans finally got their act together and they elected a Speaker of the House, and that was a big relief for me because now at least they're capable of acting, and I think they really need to. I think that the Americans, to a degree, have us by the throat because they are the source of all of the ordnance for the Air Force. They are the source for a very large fraction of our artillery shells, right? And obviously they're the source of the Iron Dome missiles and other things that we agreed idiotically in the military assistance agreement to not use the funds to manufacture ourselves. So we can't fight the war without American.
Was that part of
the 2016 one?
I did not know that.
So the thing is that we need. I mean, what the Biden administration has been doing is conditioning the transfer of these ordinances that we need on concessions to Hamas, on non attack, avoiding attacking Hezbollah, no preemptive strike against Hezbollah's missiles, etc., etc. And I don't know what they're saying on Yemen now. I mean, we're being attacked by cruise missiles. And it's not as though there are, I only can imagine, right, the number of cruise missiles that are fielded by the Houthis and Iran on the one hand, and the number of aero missiles that we have. And it's hard for me to imagine that they're equal numbers, okay? And it would seem to me that the advantage would be on their side, not on our side. So relying on missile defense for this sort of thing is insane. And so I don't know what their policies are related to the Houthis. I can only imagine that their policy in relation to preemptive strikes against Iran remains hostile as it has been since the Obama years. So I think, when you look at that, so what can the Republicans do? And I think it's really important. And, I'm not the expert that you guys probably are on Republicans. And I know that the Republicans are looking at this just as Biden is, as a way to leverage the popularity of support for Israel to force enforcement of the border security and defund or limit funding of the IRS and all the rest of it, and the hope of decoupling it from Ukraine, which was a cynical ploy by Biden to use the support that the American people have for Israel as a means to force the Republicans to give $60 billion to the Ukrainians, and so that was a cynical thing that he's done. But I think that the most important thing that Republicans can do, and that they can probably pass, is if they don't place conditions, don't allow the president to place conditions on the transfer of the munitions. So if we're getting $14 billion in ordnance and other things that we need to fight successfully, that should just be transferred to Israel. That, the conversation has to be that the draft resolution, or whatever, the draft legislation that the White House has submitted to Congress, has to be changed in a way that removes the administration's ability, or massively limits the administration's ability, to interfere with Israel's operations. And I think that that's something.
I was just going to say that Biden has promised to veto the current proposed legislation, which was, as you pointed out, the changing the IRS funding in order to fund Israel. And he said if the IRS funding is tied to Israeli funding, he'll veto that bill. I'd like to see him do that. I think that horrible.
I agree with you. I think it would be very difficult for him to veto any aid, but I would put in at all costs at the same time that there can be no conditions on the transfer of the arms to Israel, and then you can negotiate on the other things, but that change stays in. I think it's the most essential thing for Israel supporters in the United States to do, is to block Biden's efforts to undermine Israel's operational freedom, by using holding the aid hostage to American operational dictates that all undermine Israel's war effort. So that would be my very, very urgent plea from the Republicans, that they take that on.
We're working on the Hill, and we will definitely make sure that that's part of what we discuss with the congressional offices that we speak with. So thank you for that. You had brought up humanitarian aid before, and I want to just touch on that, because that's something. Not only has Biden pledged $100 million of U.S. taxpayer to go to Gaza, but Biden is also calling for, again, pauses in order for humanitarian aid to come into the Strip. And you wrote a column that you called that was called Biden's Impossible Demand, and you stated Israel's only chance of achieving its imperative of destroying Hamas as a military organization and a regime is to reject Biden's demand and block all resupply to Hamas. Can you elaborate on how Israel is supposed to deal with this pressure for humanitarian aid, which we're just hearing from all directions, and also maybe just touch on the Shifa Hospital, because that's on top of the headquarters, and there's going to be some humanitarian issues when Israel has to go after that as well.
Like Shifa, there are a lot of things that Israel has to do in order to establish the fact that it's one. I think one of them is that we have to make Gaza much smaller. I think that we need to extend our sovereignty to an area that includes the international border with Egypt. It has to include a buffer zone of a few kilometers, both north to south and also east to west, to keep them away from Ashkelon and to keep them away from the border community. So I think that a truncated Gaza, hopefully with a rebuild Gush Katif and the communities of northern Gaza, would be the way to ensure that everybody sees that the invasion of Israel brought catastrophe on the Palestinian people. And of course, the United States is doing everything in its power, not only to block that from happening, but also to empower Hamas's partner, the PA, in Judea and Samaria, and to limit and undermine Israel's military operations against the same terrorists who attacked us in Gaza from attacking our communities in Judea and Samaria. To this end, he started a campaign of demonizing people like myself who are Israeli citizens who are Jewish who live in Judea and Samaria, and he keeps referring, he and Blinken, to extremist settlers and demonizing us and coercing and pushing the government to take action against extremist settlers. And this is simply this is right out of the Hadi Amar playbook, and that's what they're doing here. So they're behaving and they are playing with fire here, because it's very clear that the Palestinians in Judea and Samaria are poised, are inspired, are empowered, are emboldened to replay what they did to the border communities along the border with Gaza, inside of Israeli communities, particularly more isolated ones, but more generally inside of Judea and Samaria. And the threat is very, very high. So by demonizing the Israelis who live here, he's signaling very clearly to the Palestinian Authority and to the Palestinians here, all of whom openly support Hamas, that the United States is with them. And that is a very, very dangerous state of affairs. And that's what Biden is doing. And it's important to point that out. And the humanitarian aid thing, again, this is just resupplying Hamas. And when National Security Council senior officials have been asked directly by outlets not known for their sympathy towards Israel, like CNN, how do you ensure that Hamas won't control the aid? They have no answer, because the answer is, of course, they can't. And it's all a lie. And there is no humanitarian aid coming in. It's all going to Hamas, who doles it out anywhere they want. And the whole idea, the whole myth that the UN is an independent actor has been manifestly proven to be untrue. It's not only that UN installations are routinely used by Hamas as missile launching sites and as places to hide their terrorists from Israeli bombers. It's also true that 90% of UNRWA employees are Hamas members. So, UNRWA and Hamas are one, and the United States and elements of the Israeli left as well have seen it as very convenient to pretend this reality away, but that doesn't make it any less true. It's absolutely true, and it's very dangerous what they're doing.
Yeah. So I'm going to try to get a couple questions in before we have to go. I lost track of time, but I do want to address something that one person posted in the questions, and they seem to be upset that we didn't focus the blame on Bibi and letting Qatar money come in and other failures. And I just want to point out that the topic of this webinar was U.S. policy that helped lead to it, and U.S. policy after October 7th. And so that's the focus of what we're talking about today. We recognize that there were intelligence failures and other failures on Israel's end as well. Someone asked Caroline that why is Israel so anxious to avoid using this opportunity to destroy Hezbollah and the Iran nuclear program? If Israel doesn't have the military capacity to fight both enemies at once, what was the point of threatening to end Iran's nuclear program with kinetic actions in the first place?
You got me. I mean, I think that now is the time to strike Iran as well. And I just don't know what our capabilities are. I mean, look, we were all flabbergasted by what we saw from the IDF on October 7th. And it's terrifying. I mean, it's like the state of Israel, the IDF just disappeared for many, many hours when they were most critically needed. And nobody could understand how this is possible. Nobody can still understand how it's possible, except that, we're led by politicians in uniforms, and they were playing key roles in the left's insurrection. I mean, the fact is that the commander of the Air Force has never spoken out against his pilots who were calling for the dismantlement effectively of the IDF as a fighting force so long as Netanyahu was prime minister. I mean, this was an attempted military coup, and it was supported from the inside by the commander of the Air Force, Tomer Bar. It was supported by Aaron Khaliwa, the head of Israel military intelligence as well. Even today, after it's manifestly his personal failing, the biggest, most colossal failure in Israeli intelligence history, this man has not resigned, And today he gave a speech attacking Netanyahu. He was talking to his officers, and he said, I read the text and I'm still in a state of shock. Netanyahu has said repeatedly that this is an existential war. This is a war for Israel's existence, which is true. Just ask the 1,500 Israelis who were slaughtered on October 7th, or the 240 Israelis who are hostages inside of Gaza. But no, Khalifa says straight out, for no reason. Nobody asked his opinion. He said, this is not an existential war. Our existence is not in danger. This is a war for our lifestyle, for our ability to go out into our fields. What is he talking about? The guy lives in La La Land, but he's still acting as an opposition politician inside of the IDF general staff in the middle of a war that was a result of his personal failure as intelligence chief. But now, what are we doing? What are we supposed to do? Are we supposed to fire the chief of staff of the IDF in the middle of the war? We can't. I think we should fire him. I think we should fire the commander of the Air Force. But who's going to replace him? The same. It'll be a brigadier general that thinks that what he did for 10 months preceding this war and allowing his pilots to run roughshod over the elected government of Israel and say that they weren't going to serve in reserves, they'll replace him. So we have a very huge problem with our senior military leadership. There's no doubt about it. Same with the head of the Shabak, who also acknowledged that he failed, but thank you very much. Now, there have been reports now that they received warning at 4 o'clock in the morning that an invasion was coming. They didn't inform the prime minister or the defense minister. And worse, they didn't inform the Gaza division so that they could wake up the soldiers. We had hundreds of soldiers killed while they were asleep because they weren't woken up. And I mean, these are things that are impossible to get your head around. And everybody keeps saying, we'll talk about it after the war. We'll talk about it after the war. We have to win the war. And it's true. But then when you see, that there is active engagement, put it this way, by U.S. officials, Marine leaders, the deputy commandant of the Marine Corps is just sitting in the Kiryat. Why? I mean, all of these things are unprecedented. The American footprint here is enormous. And you look at the nature of this administration and its hostility towards the very concept of a strategically independent, empowered Israel. And it becomes a source of alarm. It's a very difficult thing. So I agree, it would be good if we could actually have this discussion about what happened inside of Israel that fomented this colossal failure. And Netanyahu's role in this has to also be examined. Personally, I blame him only in the sense that, if you couldn't get rid of these treacherous generals in the general staff, then what the hell were you doing running again for election? If you weren't going to be able to rein them in, then why did you tell us you were? If you're not competent to lead the country, then why did you run again? We were sure you were going to be able to handle it. And you didn't. So, I mean, that's the main source of my anger at Netanyahu. I don't understand. If he knew what was going on with the general staff and he hadn't managed to deal with it in all these years, why did he think that something would change after he had been so demonized and railroaded into these fake criminal charges?
Yeah. Yeah.
Anyway, it's obviously, it's a very emotional time in Israel, and there's a lot of frustration and an enormous amount of fear, because we know we have to win this. We know that Netanyahu is right and not this, idiot failure, Aaron Khaliwa of an intelligence chief. This is an existential battle. And if we don't win this, our days will be numbered. And you look at what's happening to the Jews all over the world, it's obvious that the very survival of the Jewish people here and in the diaspora is entirely wrapped up with us winning this war. And if we don't, the kids at Harvard Yard and in the Quad in Colombia and in Dagestan and in France and in London, they have no future. And neither do any of our kids. And it is a terrifying time. So yeah, there's a lot of emotion. There's also a lot of resolve here among the Israeli people. We all, I don't know, we all, the overwhelming majority of Israelis get it and understand that we have to win. But all the time we have all of these actors coming in from America, from the left, from all of these places, and trying to undermine the resolution and to try to undermine our capacity to actually win. And we need to be clear. We need to make maximum use of our friends on the Hill. What's the point of being pro-Israel if you can't help when we need it? Let us win this war. We have to win it. Help us, give us the means to do it. Block the administration from doing what they're doing to undermine our capacity to win. Everything is on the line. I can't underline it strongly enough.
Yeah, one of the things I love about talking to you, Caroline, is your passion. And, I think that American Jews, this was a wake-up call for American Jews as well. How long they stay on board and understand this, what they do when they go to vote in 2024 is something I have less confidence in. I have a great deal of confidence in the Israeli people. And you're on the front lines. You're the canary in the coal mine. Your survival is dependent on, we're all dependent on you. And it's not just Jews. It's the West. It's the entire Western civilization is dependent on Israel winning this thing. So God bless you for everything you're doing. And our thoughts and prayers are with you and everyone in Israel. I can't thank you enough. It's after 1, so I'm going to have to end, as much as I'd rather talk to you a lot longer. But thank you so much, Caroline, as always. Thoughts and prayers.
Thank you.
And thank you all for joining. Have a good afternoon.